The Jetsons, Charlton, issue 13. Jane tells George a neighbor wants to see him for the first time in over 10 years. He says he hates to bother George and asks if he has a few minutes and decides to show him something in his garage on the 35th floor. George was getting tired from all of the walking. It's funny that he asks him if his garage is on the next planet. He sees hot rods from the 70s and recognizes them from a 70s magazine he found in a library. They're his family heirlooms, but because he's retiring to the terraformed Mercury, he wants him to give one to Elroy. He thanks him, but wonders where people would raise these things because there's no room on Earth, even though I saw roads on the ground in the 60s comic, which is obviously much better than the alternative. He looks at an outer space map and drives in space with Elroy and a kid friend of his with the hot rods in tow in a car behind him. The story ends with the two racing around a crater-filled desert on a planet called Saturn that's ridiculously small and can't be the real Saturn. And as usual, there must be a terraforming machine forcing an atmosphere and magnetosphere. I don't like that it's not Elroy saying that with all of his smarts he didn't think of this, when Elroy's supposed to be a genius. In the next story, George offers to buy some pickles for Jane from a store. He gets them put in a bag, acting polite, and by coincidence, someone with an identical bag runs into him dropping his bag because he somehow didn't look ahead when running, and George gets left with a bag of a bank robber. It's bad enough I saw this plot point once. Thankfully, the news report explains that the thief was caught carrying a bag of pickles. George gets told he's a hero, and thankfully says it was nothing, even though it's out of character for him to not get acquired situational narcissism. They end up with a $1,000 reward, and the pickles he originally bought. Good thing the police believed him that he was the owner of the bag of pickles. There's no conflict in this story, and ends too fast with almost nothing happening. So with practically no variety, it's technically a worse story, but it's a far nicer experience. In the next story, George says he spilled coffee on his pants and he's late for work. And he gives his pants to someone to clean as fast as possible. And I just hope he won't get punished for being in his boxer shorts when he usually doesn't work around other people anyways, and it won't impair him from doing his job. The cleaning chemical somehow ate right through them, so this must be the type of pants that's got no business being given to the cleaners. And George didn't know that because he never did this before. It's so frustrating as it could have easily not happened. But I guess it's not contrived. But maybe it is, because the cleaner should have asked what type of pants it was first if this can happen. He calls Jane and tells her to bring pants to his office quick. Thank goodness he goes by Spacely in a long heavy coat. And I'm just wondering why he has it. But sadly, the story doesn't explain that. I have to assume he borrowed the coat from the cleaner. It's surprising that he was perfectly fine with taking off the coat in front of his boss, revealing that he wasn't wearing pants, and put them on in front of him, because I would expect a lot of bosses to overreact and fire him for that. Thankfully, all he does is respond with a hilarious line that makes the story worth it because he's better than that. This is the first time I've ever seen someone's pants arrive at work before he did. It turns out he's smart enough not to care as long as he shows up. In the next story, a salesman tells George in a clothing store for spacesuits that look just like real suits that with every suit he gives someone a mirror for free. And that doesn't make sense because they'd lose out on money they could make from the mirror. How could that be a spacesuit? By sheer coincidence, a thief runs by him holding a bag of money, and George hides behind his mirror, causing the thief to look at it and be distracted into running into a cop, who compliments George, and George gets shown being interviewed about what he did. Somehow, the interviewer doesn't know how he caught the thief, giving him the chance to say, "No, I captured him with mirrors," even though he just had one mirror, because he wanted to make it look like a sarcastic response that was also close enough to the truth that he'd be fine with lying to look cool. Then Rosie complains to Jane that she can't seem to remember anything anymore, and she's crying with the tear ducts she got inexplicably built with. What a waste of water that was. A tube spits out coffee for Jane's cup. She tells Rosie that everyone forgets, and gets told that she's more forgetful than anyone now, and she ends up spilling her coffee. George slips on a puddle, which could have not happened because it'd be in front of him where his eyes are. So naturally, Jane tells him to stop blaming Rosie and just lie down, but at least she's still really concerned about him. She wonders if he was hurt, and Rosie volunteers to clean it up. Elroy tells her he slipped too. Clearly the artist liked him too much to show that and assumed we wouldn't want to see it. Jane decides to bring Rosie to the doctor. I don't know why it'll take a few days for her to be as good as new in the future. Judy's nice to her friend, saying she deserves to enjoy something, and Jane wonders why the puddle's there because she knows Rosie cleaned it up. She calls someone saying there's something wrong with the water computer, but theirs is on the blink, and they can't contact their mobile space repair unit. Why? And the writer was too lazy to explain it. I guess the story was on a tight deadline. George tries to help fix things, and Jane decides to get Judy to help clean up the water. She overreacts to the fact that Judy painted everything in her room black, even though she's not a goth. It's out of character for her to have an interest in goth culture. Then Rosie reveals where all the water is coming from. She bought a waterbed and forgot about it. In the next story, a doctor tells George that Rosie's computer is jammed and says he'll have her back in a few days. And it's nice that this time George acts like he cares about her when he did nothing but bash her for being outdated last story. He calls a rent-a-robot service, and then I see a butler robot again and instantly know he's in for some misery. I wonder if this guy was in the show because he showed up twice. Somehow, he's able to decide to make a list of things he won't do for them, and insists on having nothing to do with kids or pets. Why is he this lazy and still employed? At least the butler robot from earlier kinda made sense. I just didn't know why he had such a free will and was annoying his bosses, like this guy who insists he can't work because he's eaten and had coffee. Then he goes to take a nap, and somehow snores even though he's a robot. Jane complains that she and George had to do all the housework while he's just sitting there and reading. If he wants to be fired, why didn't he quit? He should know this will have to get him fired. Why don't they call his boss about this? It'd be great to see karma against him. It's satisfying to see him get handed a list by Rosie and start cutting the grass. The story ends with him being told to polish the space car and wax the kitchen floor and take Rosie out to dinner. So now it's called the space car. George wonders what's holding a cup of water in the air, as Elroy is holding a device, and gets told it's super magnets. He's holding one, and there's another magnet across the room. The glass is suspended between them. And George says if he threw a party, the glasses could be suspended, and the guests could help themselves. Jane trips on the cord, and George gets the drink spilled on him and blames Elroy. Thankfully he doesn't get punished as the story ends there, but I'm so disappointed that I didn't get to see that party. And now I'll talk about a comedy page that was in the Jetsons Giant Size first issue, the only thing in it that wasn't already in the Charlton comic. Elroy complains about some walking up walls. Elroy does it too, and George tells him he can't walk on the ceiling and he falls off. Clearly there's something magical about this kid and he gave him the power to do this, and then took it away to be a jerk for no reason. How does this make sense? The Jetsons Charlton issue 14. George gets told on the news that a planet called Lunk that's not even in our solar system is somehow heading towards the Earth because it fell out of its orbit. Why isn't it being explained why it fell out of orbit? I have to assume it was knocked out of it by the same witchcraft that created the planet in the future, or just made it inhabitable at all. At least it's an exciting idea for a story. Why is George smiling when saying that he may have to evacuate Earth? They're told that all able-bodied men have to report to Army headquarters to save the Earth. How are they supposed to prevent a planet from falling to the Earth? It's not like Earth's facing an invasion. Why does Elroy waste time thinking he'll be able to help? He's a kid. Some advise them to use the library to find out about Planet Lunk. After padding, They're told to take off by a guy at the army headquarters because he assumes kids wouldn't have advice on how to save the world from a book. And I wish it was made clear what he was busy with, because he's just standing there. Without him being busy, it'd be silly that he didn't take a few seconds to read the book just in case. Auri decides to try to save the world himself by collecting all of the ingredients with his help and firing a cannon. This makes the planet start going backwards. If even kids could do this, why did they do this before any of the other aliens on Earth with access to just as advanced knowledge of chemistry? George calls them heroes for saving the Earth, and some says they used what it said to in the book. And Auri says they shot 100 pounds of garlic at it, which I can assume makes sense to have sent it in the opposite direction because of the planet's chemical composition, meaning garlic would send it the furthest away. It's creative that it was garlic. In the next story, I wonder why the stuffed skunk George bought in the terraformed Saturn is smelly when it's stuffed. Who would waste time trying to sell that, let alone buy it? Naturally, Jane gives him a threat to get him to get that thing out of her house. After predictable stuff happens, he goes to a park bench and is told to leave there too, with a very silly threat that'll get reported to the Board of Health somehow if he doesn't. He's relatable by complaining that he feels like he's killing something and makes sure it gets blown up. Someone shows up to Jane carrying 5 more of them because it was a set and George didn't know. And somehow, the story ends with Jane leaving George and expecting the rest of her family to leave him too, with Judy lampshading that they should at least say goodbye, but Elroy doesn't care because he thinks he's an idiot, I guess. Apparently Jane's taking this as a lame excuse to leave him because she's been tired of his stupidity when he could always dynamite these or take them to the dump so they don't have to leave him. She's doing him a favor, but he won't see it that way. In the next story, Jane praises the muscles on some men at the beach in front of her husband. If he did the same thing in front of her with other women, he'd get consequences. But she doesn't even get called out on the insensitive remarks she didn't have to make. The next day, he sees instant muscles on sale at a store and impresses Jane with his looks. He gets expected to open an olive jar, but she has to. But thankfully, she doesn't make fun of him. Instead, his family throws a birthday party for him. And Rosie's somehow clumsy enough to bump into him on the way to the table despite being a robot. And that somehow pops his instant muscles by poking through his shirt with a non-sharp thing. The air hisses out of them, and that blows out the candles. It's funny that Elroy says, "Wow, he blew out all the candles with just his muscles." And Judy smiles while he looks sad. And it's nice that the story ends there, and he wasn't made fun of once. Normally I'd expect this plot to have Jane call him stupid for spending his money on that impulsively, and insists that he should just be himself, which would make no sense after the first panel. But instead it was as nice to him as possible until the forced ending, which didn't need to happen for a comic with no continuity. I assume all of the family knew it were fake muscles. In the next story, George says someone cut out the last page of his story from a magazine with an unrealistically boring cover. It's literally just blank white pages because the artist was lazy. Jane says the ending of his story must be on the other side of an old-fashioned recipe she cut out and gave to her friend. This is a creative plot. George decides to go to her to see how the story ends. He's told they're visiting their son on Mars. And it makes no sense that when he gets to her, it's 2 in the morning. He doesn't have to say what happened in the story, but he just wanted to brag that he was right, and didn't know that she'd react this way. He just said to her that he needs to have the recipe, and she was perfectly calm about giving it to him despite how early it was. So why does she hit him for having a different, equally petty reason for waking her? It's annoying that this happened purely because the writer changed the rule of the series. The story even ends with Jane being mad at George because he woke her up early too. In the next story, Spacely tells George he's counting on him to get a contract signed while he's out of town. He thankfully explains that he had another salesman on it before him and it didn't work out, so there's a reason he's resorting to him. Jane tells George when she's called that the family will do whatever it takes to help. George helps a woman out of his car and insensitively calls her pretty in front of his wife, when you'd think he would have said that the second he met her, and not wasted time repeating himself here, when he'd know Jane could get back at him for this. But while it's shocking to see George act like this when he's married, I know Jane's done this too. So Miss Cool Cash is nice enough to call him handsome to return the favor. Thankfully, when Jane's told to take care of an article of clothing of hers, she does so without inconveniencing George abusively. Rosie tells George she can't serve him dinner because the food dispenser's acting up. George decides to go to a restaurant with her, and thankfully she says something to make sure Jane would join them, and George of course invites her along. He tells her Spacely Enterprises offers the best in dividends. She shows some intelligence with her vague response, and he opens the door and flatters her, which she compliments. They get some food in front of them, and Gloria insists on waiting until later to discuss the contract, when that's the whole reason they're together. This is a ripoff of an episode of the show, and the only thing creative is that Jane's there the whole time. It's absolutely forced that when Jane says George hasn't danced with her in a long time, Gloria insists on having the first dance with him, because this contradicts how she was nothing but considerate to them earlier. Jane waits through 3 different songs where they dance together off screen, and after George tells her Gloria excused herself to powder her nose, Jane complains about George ignoring her. We never saw him interrupt her, and she should remember that he has to suck up to Gloria for the sake of his job. She's putting herself through all of this feeling left out and jealous because she went along with them because she didn't trust George to not kiss her and leave her for her. George explains himself to her. She waits some more panels and eventually goes home and whines to Rosie, with the artist emotionally manipulating you into siding with her too much because she's crying and has a stormy text bubble and talks melodramatically, even though Spacely threatens to fire George at the drop of a hat. The worst part is it's working, but she's just ignoring what George told her because she doesn't trust him, insisting that her marriage is falling apart because he's trying to humor his boss. His marriage would be more likely to fall apart if he didn't and got fired, so she's only thinking of herself. Rosie confuses me by speaking of herself in the third person out of nowhere, being mad at George when it's not fair to him because he's just following Spacely's orders. Rosie approaches George right as he's thanking her and holding a contract. The story ends with Spacely asking George what's going on at his house and wondering what's happened to the contract as Rosie's trying to force Gloria out of the house. Rosie says the contract is sewed up right in George's mouth. How does the writer think this is a happy ending when George was just following orders from his boss? This is just telling me they never should have gotten Rosie, who thinks she won't be fired no matter what she does to her boss because the family has all the power in the house, even though they're not much smarter than he is, common sense wise. It may not be Rosie's fault that she got mad at George, but it was that she chose to do this to him when she could have not done it. So she is still the bad guy for having no self-control despite being a robot. The only good thing about this panel is that it doesn't outright confirm that there won't be another contract made up and signed by Gloria. That would be unreasonable of her, because she shouldn't refuse to sign another contract just because of Rosie, which has nothing to do with whether it's a good business idea to make a deal with Spacely's company. It was kind of her fault for insisting on having so many dances with a married man. This was done better in the show where, despite the exact same plot, other than it not taking place in an interesting new setting, they still got the contract signed. And despite Jane thinking that he was cheating on her at first, she instantly calmed down when she was told what happened. In the next story, Elroy tells Sam, who's curious about what he's got, that he's building a wagon to race in the soapbox derby. And engines aren't allowed because it's supposed to coast down a steep hill. Sam says it'll help him win because he cares about Elroy, and that's literally all. He doesn't care about cheating in a competition being unfair to the other contestants. Neither does Elroy, so no wonder they're friends. Sam says he'll need to know things to put the info in his computer, and he says if they distribute the weights like it said, he'll win. The race starts, and padding happens as the wagon ends up floating upwards. for no reason considering that we didn't see any invention get used on it. And there's no indication it was modified with science or magic. But it must have cast a spell on it, or at least put potion ingredients in it, because the story ends with Elroy not knowing if he won the race as it's in orbit. And they can breathe in space because they're robots in this story. The writer didn't care enough to have logic for this story. In the comedy page, a door-to-door salesman tries to sell something to George that can destroy garbage. He does so, and somehow she screams about her car after Rosie tells her they have a phone call. The story ends with the device being thrown in the trash. I assume George pointed it at the car because it had tons of leaves in it, but there's no reason they'd all be in the car. In the next story, George gives Jane a plant and she compliments it. Tom tells Elroy to tell her to get rid of it without giving him a reason to. So of course, she doesn't listen. What did he expect? I assume the reason he expected Elroy to do it is social anxiety. Because if it was from not expecting his advice to be followed because he's not Elroy, then Elroy would know by experience not to say that Sam told him this advice. While it's good that Sam cared enough to give this advice to try to avoid the story, it's annoying that it was written to tell Elroy to say this when it was ineffective, because it means the plot could have been avoided. Jane puts the plant outside, and lights from a distant planet makes it grow really big because it's magical. This could have been avoided if either of them had the common sense to put the plant inside, which they could have easily done the second Jane walked away from it. Sam stayed at Elroy's, so he was able to wake him up and use a convenient reducing glass he had to shrink the plant. And the story ends with Elroy and him having some charming dialogue where they get along well. If it was so easy for him to deal with the plant, there was no reason for him to wake Elroy up other than to show him his saving the day because of his ego. There wasn't any conflict in the first story. George's neighbor gives him some cars that even Elroy and his friends can drive, on a version of Saturn that has to be only survivable because of magic. In the second story, George accidentally foils a bank robbery because the guy bumps into him and picks up the wrong bank, after George buys cooking ingredients just fine. It may be short with no real conflict, but I like how harmless it is compared to the complete drag that is the story it reminds me of. But this didn't really require sci-fi. The third story has George barely arrive on time at work and need his pants cleaned, but somehow he's fine with revealing that he wasn't wearing pants under a coat in front of his boss, and his only reaction to it is a funny quip, because he's actually smart enough to only care about how competent he is at his job. Once again, it was a story that only pretended to have a problem in it, because if he didn't care, there was really no hurry for Jane to get his pants to work, even if he thought there was, and made the audience think there was tension. But I'll take harmless short stories without enough troubles any day over something needlessly depressing and long. So no conflict isn't a damning criticism. This wasn't quite sci-fi enough though. Then the fourth story has George defeat a bank robber because he gets distracted by the mirror he's holding and runs into a cop. So that's creative, even if it's an overly short plot where he had nothing to worry about. It could have taken place in modern times for all the difference it made. Just replace the word spacesuit with suit. The fifth story has Rosie be too forgetful and need repairs because of it, and the floor has a constant problem with spilled water. The family having to deal with that over and over is repetitive and easy to write, but at least it's a plot with an ongoing conflict this time. The sixth story has the rented replacement for Rosie be a lazy incompetent moron, which is a cliche and makes no sense at all because he's a robot, so he'd be better than that. For one, to be a better plot if it was set in modern times, which it might as well have been. Just replace the robot with a human and the word robot with a maid. The seventh story has Elroy show off his new toy magnets that I guess he only has because some bought him them, since his parents need to be told about them, only for a glass of water to spill on George when Jane trips on a cord. You'd think she wouldn't have tripped because she'd see it, because her eyes are in the front of her face. But it doesn't matter because we don't see Elroy get punished for it. It's just disappointing that George just references the idea of having a party with floating glasses instead of us seeing it. The first story had a planet hurtling towards the Earth for no reason, and eventually Elroy reads that he has to use a conveniently unmanned cannon to fire garlic at it. Maybe it's Sam's cannon. So that was creative, even if it shouldn't have wasted that many panels on them finding out how to save the day. The second story is about George buying something smelly for no reason that somehow is being sold when the person selling it would think there wasn't any demand, and would have just put it at the dump instead. And Jane doesn't want it, and he has a hell of a time giving it away, so he has to blow it up. This had nothing to do with sci-fi, and it was just a repetitive, predictable, depressing plot. The third story had Jane's insensitive praise of muscular men in front of George caused him to buy instant muscles to wear under his shirt. And thankfully his family never mistreats him for it, even when it turns out he's not strong. Because I guess they were polite enough to feign ignorance, and instead he's given a birthday party. But it was forced that Rosie somehow bumped into him and got rid of the instant muscles. I'm glad there was never a typical message that George made a mistake doing this and should just be himself, because it was just nice of him to do this to humor his wife. So it would be no big deal for him to wear this at home every day. The fourth story is George wants to read the story in a magazine that got sent over to Mars because of Jane, who's suddenly interested in old-fashioned recipes, and George gets it and gets hit because it was 2 in the morning by the time he asked for it. It's an interesting story, so it was worth it. It should have been explained that George was having car trouble. The fifth story is about George flattering someone for a business deal for Spacely because he told him to make sure the contract would get signed. And because that someone's a pretty woman when she could have easily not been, Jane gets jealous, but doesn't simply refuse to be in the same room as her the whole time, which I assume is because she doesn't trust George not to kiss her. Her idiotic lack of trust in him for no reason caused her to put herself through all of the suffering in this story. So it's needlessly frustrating that the writer and artist try to manipulate us into pitying her, as if he was somehow betraying her by trying to keep his career. I was just enjoying how George was making Gloria feel good with compliments, and Gloria's nothing but considerate in return, until she's out of character unnecessarily. So the story doesn't really suck. It just has a horrible ending because Rosie flips out on her own boss and makes me assume she ruined things at the last second. But at least that's not confirmed. It'd be unfair of Gloria to blame him for his evil maid's anger management issues. She had no excuse to get mad at George. The story's got nothing to do with sci-fi and it's probably cliché. The sixth story was a generic plot where Elroy wants to win a soapbox race, and Sam has a plan to cheat so he'll win. But what sucks is that we aren't told exactly what he really did to make it so that he ends up in orbit. All we know is that he put data into his computer and then distributed weights on it, when I don't see any weights on it other than the 2 of them. It has to be that Sam put potion ingredients in it. But that's not explained, and neither is them not suffocating. So I guess Sam cast a spell to protect them. So the story sucks because of the lack of logic and creativity, and it being too short for there to be enough happening. Remove the one panel at the end, and it'd have nothing sci-fi about it if you draw Sam as a human. The seventh story gives away immediately what the twist will be because Sam wants Jane's plants gotten rid of. And I have to assume they doesn't destroy it because he doesn't want Elroy to get punished for it. So because both of them were too stupid to just move the plant as soon as Jane walked away from it, or at least get some to create a plant decoy, it grows really huge, the most predictable twist ever. It doesn't help that I already saw this happen to plants in Fairly Odd Parents. It doesn't make sense when it easily could have, because its supposed cause is the light from a really far away planet. So it should have been explained that it was magic that made this happen, instead of the plot having no excuse. The plants could have been from a witch, but it's not that big a deal because Sam shrinks it effortlessly.